In the flickering candlelight of a medieval church, two impossible children stand before a priest whose world of reason is crumbling. Their skin glows with the vibrant green of spring leaves. They speak in melodies no human tongue has ever formed. They claim to come from a land beneath the earth where the sun never shines. Father Anselm built his faith on logic and observable truth. But what happens when the impossible walks through your door, breathing and terrified and utterly, undeniably real? The sound was rhythmic, methodical. A steady, stony grinding of herb against ceramic that measured the passing moments in dust and fragrant powder. In the quiet solitude of his study, attached to the cold stone flank of the village church, Father Anselm found a different kind of prayer. It was a prayer of process, of tangible reality. The sun, streaming in a sharp blade of light through a high, narrow window, illuminated a universe of dancing dust motes. On the wall, a detailed diagram of the comfrey plant, its roots and leaves meticulously rendered in charcoal, was tacked right next to a simple wooden cross. In Anselm's world, there was no conflict between the two. One was God's word, the other was God's work. Both demanded to be understood. He scraped the resulting green paste from the mortar into a small wooden bowl, a poultice for old Mab's leg. A mixture of comfrey to knit the bone and yarrow, to staunch the inevitable bleeding from her fall. It was a science passed down from the monasteries, a practical application of the gifts God had left growing in the soil. The heavy oak door to his study creaked open. Brother Michael, a novice barely old enough to grow a proper beard, shuffled in, his eyes wide with the perpetual anxiety of youth. He clutched something in his hand, something Anselm recognized with an internal sigh, a small charm woven from twigs of ash and bound with red thread. "The poultice is ready," Anselm said, his voice calm and even, not looking up from his work. "How is Thomas's fever?" "No change, Father," Michael whispered. He held up the charm. "His mother gave me this, for protection from the ill humors she says are plaguing him." Anselm finally looked up, his gaze falling on the pathetic little tangle of wood and superstition. His eyes, sharp and clear, held no warmth for the object. "Ill humors," he repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, "or a fever born of bad water and a weak constitution. An ill humor is a ghost, Michael. A fantasy to blame when the real culprit is hiding in the well or the larder." He wiped his hands on a clean cloth. "Take the boy this willow bark tea I prepared. Have his mother boil it 3 times a day. God and a clean bandage are the only protection he needs. Trust in what you can see and touch. The rest is fear, and fear is a shadow that offers no comfort." The novice nodded, chastened, and scurried away, leaving Anselm alone once more with the quiet hum of his rational faith. He looked at the cross on his wall. To know God was to know his creation, and his creation was a world of order, of cause and effect. A world that could be measured, understood, and with care, mended. Out in the fields that rolled away from the village of Woolpit, the world was anything but orderly. It was a place of wind and toil, of life and sudden death. Edwig and Osbert, 2 hunters whose grime-caked clothes spoke of a life spent wresting a living from the earth, were checking their snares. It was a poor day. A few rabbits, a skinny fox. Osbert, a man of few words and fewer fancies, moved with a pragmatic efficiency, resetting the traps with calloused hands. Edwig, however, was a man who saw omens in the shape of clouds and heard whispers on the wind. They approached the last trap, one set near the overgrown moor of an ancient pit, dug generations ago to catch the wolves that once plagued these lands. It was a deep, menacing scar on the landscape, its edges thick with thorns and tangled weeds. As they drew near, a sound drifted up from its depths. It was faint, muffled by the earth, a sound that didn't belong to the fields. It was a strange, high-pitched warbling, like the distant ringing of tiny bells, yet threaded with something that sounded distressingly like crying. Edwig froze. His hand flew up, making the sign of the cross against his chest. "You hear that?" He breathed, his eyes wide with fear. "The old tales they speak of sprites that live beneath the soil. They lure you to the edges of their world and pull you under." Osbert grunted, dismissing the notion with a shake of his head. He crept to the edge of the pit, his curiosity overriding any sense of caution. He peered down into the gloom. The breath hitched in his throat. His face, already weathered and brown, went pale. He didn't scream. He didn't speak. He simply scrambled backward on all fours, his eyes locked on the pit, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. The sight of his stoic companion so utterly undone was more terrifying to Edwig than any folk tale. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum of terror. Trembling, driven by a morbid curiosity that was stronger than his fear, he forced himself to the edge. He looked down, and the world of omens and whispers, of ill humours and pagan fears, seemed to rise up from that dark hole to swallow him whole. Dusk had settled over Woolpit, softening the hard edges of the world into shades of grey and purple. Inside the church, Anselm was on his knees, the familiar Latin of the evening vespers a comforting rhythm on his tongue. The scent of old stone and beeswax was the scent of peace, of sanctuary. The peace was shattered. The great oak doors of the church were thrown open with a crash that echoed through the nave like a thunderclap. A sudden wind snaked through the sanctuary, guttering the candles. Anselm looked up, startled, as Edwig and Osbert stumbled in, their faces masks of pure terror. "Father, you must come!" Edwig gasped, pointing a trembling finger back at the door. "Devils! They crawled from the earth itself!" "Not devils!" Osbert managed, his voice a raw croak. "Something else." Behind them, a crowd of villagers pushed in, their faces a morbid mixture of fear and excitement. They parted, and two figures were herded forward into the flickering candlelight. They were children. A boy and a girl no older than 10, holding onto each other as if for dear life. Their clothes were the first strange thing Anselm noticed. They were not wool or linen, but woven from some unfamiliar, fibrous plant. They chattered to each other, a stream of incomprehensible sounds, high and melodic, like no language Anselm had ever heard. But that was not what held the room in silent, horrified thrall. It was their skin. In the warm, wavering light of the candles, their skin was undeniably, impossibly green. Not the pale green of sickness, but the vibrant, living green of new spring leaves. Anselm rose slowly to his feet, the words of his prayer forgotten. His mind, that orderly, rational sanctuary, was thrown into chaos. He felt a sudden, vertiginous lurch, as if the solid stone floor beneath him had turned to water. The villagers saw a demon, a curse. Anselm saw a violation of natural law. His mind raced, grasping for an explanation, for a category that could contain this. Poison? Arsenic was known to tinge the skin, but not like this. A disease unknown to Christendom. A trick of the light. He took a step forward, his face becoming a mask of intense clinical curiosity that only barely concealed the profound shock beneath. The children shrank back, their large dark eyes wide with a terror that was all too human. He saw their fear, and it was the only recognizable thing about them. He moved closer, his gaze sweeping over their impossible skin, their strange clothes, his world of cause and effect dissolving before his very eyes. The whispers of the villagers faded away. The scent of beeswax and stone was gone. There was only this impossible fact, standing small and terrified in the heart of his logical world. And for the first time in his life, Father Anselm had no answer. Anselm had barred the heavy oak door to his quarters, shutting out the fearful whispers and wide-eyed stares of his flock. The chaos of the church had been replaced by the heavy, oppressive silence of a room now occupied by an impossible reality. By the warm, dancing light of the hearth, The two children slept, their small bodies curled together on a pallet Anselm had laid out for them. In sleep, they looked almost normal, were it not for the soft, verdant glow their skin cast in the firelight. Anselm, however, could not rest. He sat at his simple wooden desk, a thick piece of parchment spread before him, the frantic scratching of his quill the only sound in the room. He was not writing a letter to the bishop or a sermon for the coming Sunday. He was doing the only thing he knew how to do when faced with the unknown. He was observing, recording, and attempting to impose order. This was not a matter for prayer. Not yet. It was a problem to be solved. His notes were a cascade of questions and theories. Item: the subjects, a male and a female of approximately 10 years, present with a cutaneous condition of unknown origin. The coloration is a vibrant green, akin to young leaves, and appears integral to the skin, not a surface pigment. It does not rub away with water. Item: their language is unlike any known dialect. It is composed of high-pitched melodic sounds, almost like birdsong, yet with a clear emotional cadence. Item: their garments are of a woven plant fiber, coarse to the touch, and of a design I have never encountered. He paused, dipping his quill in the inkpot. What could it be? His logical mind, trained to see cause and effect in God's world, offered up possibilities, each more tenuous than the last. Hypothesis 1. A form of chlorosis, a sickness of the blood brought on by a profound lack of proper nourishment. Yet I have never seen it present in such a vivid hue. Hypothesis 2. Arsenic poisoning. There are tales of springs in the deep woods, their water tainted by the earth's poisons, that can alter the color of a man's skin. Perhaps they drank from such a place for many weeks. Hypothesis 3. They have subsisted on a diet of some unknown root or fungus, one with powerful properties of coloration. The boy stirred on the pallet, letting out a soft, mournful cry. Anselm's scientific detachment evaporated, replaced by a priest's simple pity. He rose and went to them, holding a small bowl of bread soaked in goat's milk. He knelt, offering it gently. The children recoiled, their dark eyes filling with tears as they looked at the food. They shook their heads violently, chattering to each other in their strange musical tongue, a sound of clear distress and refusal. Anselm sighed, placing the untouched bowl aside. His first experiment had been a failure. Days turned into a week. The children remained weak, spectres of green haunting the corners of Anselm's quiet life. They refused all food he offered: bread, salted pork, cooked vegetables, even honey. They were fading before his eyes. Then, one afternoon, an idea sparked in Anselm's mind. It was a simple thing, born of desperation. He was in his garden, tending to the neat rows of vegetables that were his pride, a testament to the predictable bounty of the earth. The children watched him from the doorway, their faces listless and withdrawn. Remembering their fear of cooked food, he walked over to a thriving vine of broad beans, its pods plump and green in the afternoon sun. On impulse, he plucked a handful of pods, split one open with his thumbnail, and held out the raw, pale beans in his palm. The reaction was instantaneous. The children's eyes, so long dull with lethargy, lit up with a shocking blaze of recognition. Before Anselm could even process what was happening, they had scrambled forward. They didn't take the beans politely. They snatched them from his hand with a desperate, trembling urgency, stuffing them into their mouths and chewing with ravenous energy. It was the first time he had seen them show any sign of life beyond fear and sorrow. A flicker of pure intellectual triumph ignited within him. It was the thrill of a puzzle piece clicking into place. He watched them devour the beans, a slow smile spreading across his face. He had found a key. He hurried back to his desk, to his notes, and added a new entry, his handwriting bold and confident. They consume only raw beans, refusing all other sustenance. This confirms a specific and severe dietary deficiency is the most likely cause of their unique condition. With a controlled diet, I am confident their health and natural coloration can be restored. In that moment, the mystery felt solved. The world was, once again, an orderly place. Weeks passed. The false dawn of Anselm's victory had given way to a long, dreadful twilight. His confidence had curdled into a constant, gnawing anxiety. The girl, whom he had started to think of as Agnes, was indeed stronger. She had taken to other foods now: bread, soft cheeses, apples, and the vivid green of her skin had begun to fade, receding into a pale, sallow olive. His theory seemed to be holding, but the boy was another story. He was wasting away. The new diet that seemed to be saving his sister was having no effect on him. He lay on the pallet by the fire, his small chest barely rising and falling, his breathing a shallow, rattling whisper. Against his pale, bloodless lips, his green skin seemed to have grown even more pronounced, a ghastly, unnatural shade. He refused all food now, even the beans he had once eaten with such relish. The girl would sit by his side for hours, weeping silently and speaking to him in their strange, soft language, a constant, heartbreaking monologue. Anselm did everything he could. He applied cool cloths to the boy's burning forehead. He brewed strengthening broths of bone and herbs, forcing the liquid drop by drop between his cracked lips. Nothing worked. The boy was slipping away. Pulled under by a tide Anselm could not see, let alone fight. One night, Anselm stood over the dying child, looking from his feverish form to the confident note still sitting on his desk. A specific dietary deficiency, I am confident the words seemed to mock him. The foolish, arrogant scribbles of a man who thought he could chart the ocean with a cup. He was powerless. Reason had failed him. Dawn broke, painting the high-arched window of the church in hues of soft grey and rose. But inside, there was only cold, silent finality. The boy was dead. His small body lay still on the pallet, finally at peace. Anselm drew a simple linen cloth over his face, the gesture feeling hollow, inadequate. He knelt beside the pallet, his own body heavy with failure, and began to perform the last rites, his voice a low monotone in the vast empty church. The girl was huddled in a corner, her face turned to the stone wall, a small silent statue of grief. As Anselm's whispered Latin filled the space, the side door creaked open. It was Edwig, the hunter, holding a small wooden bowl with a morning offering of eggs. He stopped dead in the doorway, his eyes taking in the scene, the priest on his knees, the silent girl, and the shrouded form on the floor. His face, already prone to fear, contorted into a mask of pure terror. He didn't see a tragedy, he saw a confirmation. He saw the result of a curse. Edwig didn't say a word. He simply backed away, his eyes never leaving the dead child. His hand flew up, making the frantic sign against evil. He turned and fled, the offering of eggs tumbling from his grasp and smashing on the stone steps. Anselm watched him go, and a cold dread settled in his stomach, a feeling worse than grief. He had lost the boy to a mystery he couldn't solve. And now, he knew, the fear and superstition of the village would come for the girl. The work of burial was a grim, solitary affair. Anselm had chosen a small, unmarked corner of the churchyard, consecrated ground, but away from the neat rows of familiar village names. He didn't want the boy's final resting place to become a site of superstitious pilgrimage or fearful avoidance. It was just a small body being returned to the earth. The shovel felt heavy in his hands, each scoop of damp soil a punctuation mark on his own failure. He worked until his back ached and sweat beaded on his brow, the physical exertion a welcome distraction from the circular, unanswerable questions that plagued his mind. Throughout the ordeal, the girl had watched from a distance, standing unnervingly still by the ancient yew tree at the edge of the graveyard. Her expression was unreadable, a placid mask that betrayed nothing of the grief or terror that must have been churning within her. She did not weep or cry out. She simply observed, a silent witness to the strange burial rites of a world that was not her own. When Anselm finally patted the last mound of earth into place, planting a simple, unadorned wooden cross to mark the spot, she moved. She walked slowly, deliberately, toward the fresh grave. In her small hand, she held something Anselm couldn't initially make out. She knelt, her small fingers brushing the dirt, and placed her offering on the grave. It was a single, raw, broad beam. Anselm stared at the gesture. It was a ritual, an act of faith, a piece of a story he had no way of reading. It fit no category he knew. It was not Christian prayer, nor was it the familiar pagan superstition of his own village. It was something other. As he watched her, head bowed over the grave of her brother, the afternoon sun caught the side of her face. And for the first time, Anselm noticed it clearly. The change. The vivid, leaf-like green had receded from her skin. It was still there, but it was muted, faded to a pale, sallow olive hue. A living paradox, a ritual from an unknown world, performed by a body that was, against all logic, responding to his own worldly science. Months passed. The raw wound of the boy's death slowly scarred over, leaving a permanent mark on the village's memory and on Anselm's soul. The girl remained with him, a quiet presence in the rectory. Anselm, in a moment of searching for some semblance of normalcy, had named her Agnes. And Agnes, with the remarkable resilience of the young, began to learn. The priest's study, once a place of lonely scholarly pursuit, became a classroom. Cup, Anselm would say, holding up the wooden vessel. Q-P. Ka, Agnes would repeat, her tongue struggling to form the unfamiliar sounds. Fire, Anselm would say, pointing to the hearth. Fi, she would echo, a flicker of understanding in her dark eyes. Patiently, day by day, he gave her the gift of his language, and she, in turn, began to emerge from her shell of silence. With the new words came a new confidence. And with the new diet of bread and cheese and cooked meats, her body continued its strange transformation. The last vestiges of green faded from her skin, leaving behind only a curious pallor, as if she had lived her entire life indoors, away from the sun. The physical mystery, it seemed, was solving itself. Anselm should have felt triumphant. Instead, a deep disquiet grew within him. The evidence of his eyes told him his dietary theory was correct, yet the small cross in the churchyard was a constant damning testament to how wrong he had been. One evening, as rain lashed against the windows, Anselm sought to connect with the girl beyond mere vocabulary. He took a piece of charcoal from the hearth, and on a spare piece of parchment, he drew a circle with radiant lines pointing outward. Sun, he said, smiling. The sun. Agnes looked at his drawing, then shook her head slowly. She reached out a small hand, and Anselm, intrigued, gave her the charcoal. Her grip was clumsy, but her intent was clear. She drew another circle, next to his, but her circle had no radiant lines. It was a simple, dim orb. She looked up at him, her eyes serious. She pointed a small finger down at the stone floorboards beneath their feet. St. Martin's Land, she said, the words broken, pieced together from her new vocabulary. No sun, twilight. Anselm froze, the charcoal still in his hand. The air in the room suddenly felt thick, heavy. The medical mystery was over. A narrative one, far more vast and terrifying, had just begun. He was no longer a physician observing a patient. He was a lone scholar, sitting in a small, rain-swept room, listening to a traveler's tale from a country that could not possibly exist. A week later, Anselm stood with Agnes on the lip of the Woolpit. He had brought her here with a clear purpose, to ground her fantastic story in the cold, hard reality of this world. He believed her tale of a sunless land was a fantasy, a story a traumatized child had invented to cope with the memory of being abandoned and left to die. He hoped that seeing the place, the real place, would jog a more realistic memory. "Agnes," he said gently, trying to keep the skepticism from his voice. "Show me. Show me how you came to be in the pit. Was there a path? Did you fall from the edge?" She looked at him, then looked down into the overgrown darkness of the pit. She didn't point to the path they had just walked. She didn't point to the crumbling edges. She pointed directly down, into the center of the hole. In her halting, carefully chosen English, she began to speak. "We were with my father's flock, in St. Martin's Land." Her eyes glazed over, seeing a place that was not there. Then a sound, loud, like all the bells, all the church bells at once. She put her hands over her ears as if to block out the memory of the noise. We followed the sound. It was a spinning, a turning, then light, so bright. She squinted, her face contorting at the memory of the pain. It blinded us, and we were here, at the bottom, in the dark of the pit. Anselm stared at her. He had come here for a confession of a simple, tragic accident. Instead, she had given him a detailed, emotionally resonant account of an interdimensional kidnapping. Her story was consistent, her conviction absolute. His rational investigation had slammed into a wall of pure, unshakable testimony. He looked from her earnest, believing face to the mundane hole in the ground. It was just a pit. But her story filled it with an impossible, terrifying significance that his science had no tools to excavate. That night, Anselm sat alone in his study. The only light came from the fire, casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. On his desk, side by side, lay two pieces of parchment. They were two different worlds, two opposing truths. The first was his original log, his scientific record. It was neat, logical, written in his precise, scholarly hand. It detailed his observations of their symptoms, the introduction of a new diet, the gradual fading of the green hue in the survivor. It was a story of a medical anomaly observed and, in part, resolved through rational methods. It was the world he believed in. The second parchment was new, its writing looser, more hurried. It was his transcription of Agnes's testimony. St. Martin's Land, a world of perpetual twilight, a great river separating them from a more luminous land. The sound of bells, a sudden, inexplicable transport. It was a fairy tale, a piece of folklore, the kind of superstitious nonsense he had spent his life trying to purge from his parish. He stared at the two documents, his face a storm of conflict. The first was the truth of the physical world. The second was the truth of a child's memory. One was evidence. The other was faith. They could not both be true, and yet they both existed, lying on his desk, demanding to be acknowledged. With a sudden surge of frustration, he snatched up the second parchment, the one containing Agnes's impossible story. He crushed it in his fist, the crackling of the parchment a scream in the silent room. He held the crumpled ball over the fire, ready to commit it to the flames, to erase the illogical narrative and restore order. But he couldn't. His hand trembled. He slowly, painstakingly, smoothed the parchment back out on the desk, its new wrinkles a permanent testament to his struggle. He could not destroy it. He could not dismiss it. He was a man of reason, now forced to be the keeper of a story that defied all of it. The two parchments lay on Father Anselm's desk like a verdict and a confession. One was the world as he knew it, a place of measurable cause and observable effect. The other was the world Agnes had given him, a place of impossible twilight and terrifying wonders. His tidy, rational mind, once a fortress, was now a city under siege from within. He could not burn the girl's story, and so he found he could no longer ignore it. If the answer to this riddle was not in the tangible world of herbs and poultices, then he would have to search for it in the only other place available to him, the accumulated knowledge of the past. He retreated to the church scriptorium, a small, cold room smelling of damp stone and decaying parchment. For days, he lost himself in the dusty scrolls and leather-bound books of the monastery's small library. He was a man possessed, his quest no longer purely scientific, but desperate. He first turned to the official chronicles, the histories of the realm, and the theological treatises of the Church Fathers. He read of the great comet of the last century, a fiery sword in the sky, recorded as a clear omen of goddess wrath. He read of plagues and famines, all meticulously documented as divine punishment for the sins of mankind. These were anomalies, yes, but they were known anomalies, catalogued and explained within the firmament of his faith. They offered him no comfort, no parallel to the green children who crawled out of the earth. His frustration mounting, he turned, with a sense of self-loathing, to a section of the library he had always pointedly ignored. It was a collection of local lore, tales gathered by a long-dead monk with a questionable interest in the pagan superstitions that still clung to the countryside like morning mist. These were the stories Anselm had always dismissed as the fantasies of idle, uneducated minds. Tales of fae folk who stole beautiful babies from their cribs, leaving behind sickly, unsettling replicas known as changelings. Tales of spirits who lived in the deep woods and soured the milk of those who displeased them. He scanned the brittle pages, his scholarly mind repulsed by the lack of logic, by the sheer, childish fancy of it all. He was about to give up, to slam the book shut on this world of nonsense, when a single passage snagged his attention. It was a footnote, a half-remembered piece of folklore from a nearby region. It spoke of a belief that there were beings who dwelt in the hollows of the earth, in a world without a sun. And it claimed that these beings were sometimes lured to the surface, confused and lost, by the powerful resonant sound of church bells, which they mistook for a call from their own subterranean world. Like all the church bells at once, Agnes S. words echoed in the silent scriptorium, a sudden, chilling chorus to the ancient text. The book slammed shut with a crack that sent a cloud of dust into the air. Anselm recoiled from it as if it were a venomous snake. He had found a precedent. He had found a story that matched hers, but it was not a history. It was not a science. It was a superstition. He felt a wave of disgust, not at the book, but at himself. He, a man of God and reason, had waded into the swamp of folklore and found something that looked disturbingly like an answer. The world outside the church walls had not been waiting for Anselm to solve his philosophical dilemma. It had been drawing its own, much simpler, conclusions. When he next walked with Agnes through the village market, the change was palpable. Agnes herself was almost unrecognizable from the creature who had emerged from the pit months ago. She wore a simple peasant dress, her hair was clean and tied back, and her face was that of any other child, save for a lingering, unnatural pallor and a constant, watchful stillness in her eyes. But the villagers saw only the ghost of what she had been. They stared. Their friendly greetings to their priest were now clipped, their eyes darting nervously toward the girl at his side. He saw them whispering behind their hands, their gossip spreading through the market stalls like a contagion. One woman, seeing them approach, physically grabbed her own son by the arm and pulled him away, as if Agnes's very presence was a sickness. Then he saw Edwig the hunter, standing near the butcher's stall. The man's fear had long since hardened into a kind of hateful righteousness. He didn't whisper. He glared, his expression a mixture of accusation and loathing that made Anselm's stomach tighten. Before he could react, he was stopped by the reeve, the stern, pragmatic official who managed the village's secular affairs. The reeve was not a man given to fancy. His concerns were crops, taxes, and order. He nodded curtly at Anselm, his eyes grim. "Father," he said, his voice low. A word of warning. "The people are frightened." He gestured vaguely at Agnes. "They are not comfortable. Old Man Hemlock's cow died last night, and the milk from 3 households soured before it could be churned." He fixed Anselm with a hard stare. "They say the girl is not right. They say she brought the blight." Anselm felt a cold anger rise in him. That is superstitious nonsense. A sick cow and warm weather are not the work of a child. "It doesn't matter what it is," the reeve countered, his voice sharp. It matters what they believe it is. Fear is a blight of its own, Father, and it is spreading. Keep her close." The reeve gave him a final, meaningful look and walked away, leaving Anselm standing in the middle of the market, the invisible walls of the village's fear closing in around him, and the child he had sworn to protect. Night fell, and with it, the fear festered. It had been stoked by whispers and fanned by gossip until it had grown into a living, breathing thing. Anselm was in his study, trying to read, when he first heard it. A low murmur from outside, a sound that quickly grew into angry shouts. He went to the main doors of the church and peered through the small grate. His heart sank. A mob had gathered in the churchyard. It wasn't large, perhaps 20 men, but in the flickering, hellish light of the torches they carried, they seemed a legion. They held farm implements, pitchforks, scythes, heavy wooden cudgels. And at their head, his face contorted with a terrible, zealous fury, was Edwig. A heavy fist pounded on the ancient oak door. "Father Anselm," Edwig's voice roared, raw with hatred. "We know she is in there. Send out the changeling. Send out the demon before it brings ruin on us all." Anselm staggered back from the door as if struck. He spun around and threw the heavy iron bolt into place, the sound echoing through the cavernous church. Behind him, he heard a small, terrified whimper. Agnes was huddled at the base of the altar, her face pale with terror, tears streaming down her cheeks. The shouts from outside grew louder, a chaotic chorus of "Witch! Demon! Send her out!" The pounding on the door became more frantic, a violent, splintering rhythm. Anselm looked from the terrified, weeping child to the thick oak door that was the only thing between her and the mindless, superstitious fury of the mob. The two parchments in his study, the neat record of science and the messy account of faith, were no longer abstract theories. They had come to life, and he was trapped between them, forced to physically defend the impossible anomaly he had taken in from the brutal certainty of the normal world. The pounding on the door was the heartbeat of a monster, a frantic, hateful rhythm that shook the very stones of the church. Inside, Agnes S. weeping was a thin, terrified counterpoint. Anselm looked at her, huddled and small at the foot of the altar, and the maelstrom of his intellectual conflict, the war between his parchments and his philosophies, vanished. It was replaced by a single, diamond-hard point of clarity. He was a priest. This was his church, and that was his child to protect. His fear transmuted into a cold, righteous anger. He walked to the heavy sacristy chest and lifted from it the large, ornate processional cross, its wood polished smooth by the hands of generations of priests. It was heavy, a weapon of faith. Holding it before him like a shield, he strode to the great oak doors. The mob outside roared, emboldened by his approach. With a single decisive movement, Anselm threw back the heavy iron bolt. The sound was like a cannon shot in the enclosed space. He pulled the doors open and stepped out onto the top step, into the hellish, flickering light of the torches. The mob recoiled for a half step, surprised by his sudden appearance. Their angry shouts faltered. Anselm stood there, his face grim and set like stone, the great cross held before him. He did not appeal to their reason. He did not offer explanations or debate the nature of sick cows. He met their superstitious fear with the unshakable authority of his office. His voice, when it came, was not the measured tone of a scholar, but the thunder of a prophet. "You stand before the house of God with weapons in your hands and hatred in your hearts," he boomed, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. "You cry demon and witch, but the only evil here tonight is your own fear. Fear is the devil's work. It is the rot that sours the soul, not the milk. You would listen to the pagan whispers of the ignorant and abandon the word of God." He took a step down, and the crowd shuffled back. He raised the cross higher, pointing it directly at Edwig, whose face, so full of fury moments before, was now slack-jawed with shock. "You!" Anselm roared, his voice cracking with righteous fury. "You would defy God's holy law to shelter the lost and protect the innocent. You would cast out a child whom he has placed in my care. Is your faith so weak that you would see the work of the devil in a frightened girl, and not the test of God in your own cowardly hearts. The words struck the mob like a physical blow. He was not arguing with them. He was judging them. He was using their own language of faith and damnation, and turning it back upon them with a conviction that dwarfed their own. They looked at each other, their anger wavering, the farm implements suddenly feeling foolish and heavy in their hands. They were a mob no longer, but a shamed congregation before their priest. One by one, they lowered their eyes. Someone dropped a torch, its flame hissing on the damp ground. And then, like a tide receding, they began to disperse, melting back into the darkness, leaving only silence and the smell of smoke behind. The quiet that followed was profound, deeper than the silence before the mob had formed. Anselm stood on the steps for a long moment, the heavy cross seeming to anchor him to the spot. He could feel a stinging on his forehead and raised a hand to it, his fingers coming away wet. A thrown stone had found its mark. He barely registered the pain. He barred the doors once more and returned to the sanctuary. Agnes had cried herself to sleep at the foot of the altar. He gently lifted her small, light body into his arms and carried her to his own quarters, laying her on his bed and covering her with a blanket. He sat in the chair by the fire, dabbing his cut with a cloth soaked in water. He had won. He had protected her. But as he looked at her sleeping face, so peaceful now, he felt no sense of victory. The external battle was over, but the war within him raged on. He had no more answers now than he did an hour ago. He had only a deeper, more painful understanding of the question. He had stared into the face of his flock-ass fear and seen a distorted reflection of his own confusion. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, what he must do next. He had to make a record, a report for the Abbey, for his superiors, for history. He had to commit this story to parchment, and in doing so, finally choose what it was that he believed. Night deepened. The fire burned down to glowing embers. Anselm sat at his desk, a fresh, clean sheet of vellum before him, its smooth surface waiting. This was his final crucible. He dipped his quill and began to write. His first words were clear, precise, the language of a scholar. He wrote of the observable, the measurable, the tangible. He detailed the date of the children's discovery. He described their physical appearance, the shade and texture of their unusual skin. He noted their incomprehensible language and their initial refusal of all food save for the raw beans. He chronicled the boy's swift decline and death, a failure of all his ministrations. He then carefully documented the girl's slow recovery, the gradual fading of her green coloration over many months on a varied diet, the successful acquisition of the English tongue. He read it over. It was a perfect, dispassionate record of a strange but likely medical phenomenon. It was the truth, but it was not the whole truth. He pushed the finished document aside. He took a new, clean sheet of parchment. He dipped his quill again. This time, his writing was different. Less a report, more a transcription. He began to write Agnes's story. He wrote of St. Martin's Land, a world of perpetual twilight. He wrote of the great wide river she said separated her people from another, more luminous land. He wrote of the sudden, deafening sound, like all the church bells of the world ringing at once. He wrote of the disorienting journey and of waking, blinded by a sun they had never known, at the bottom of a pit in a strange, loud, terrifying world. He wrote it all, exactly as she had told it to him. He offered no explanation, no judgment, no endorsement or dismissal. He simply recorded it, her testimony, as a thing that had been spoken. He was a man of science, and he had recorded the data. He was a man of faith, and he had taken a confession. Years passed. The seasons turned, and the sharp edges of the story softened into the smooth stone of local legend. Agnes grew into a young woman, her past a curious footnote to a normal life. The strange pallor of her skin remained, as did a certain quiet, watchful quality in her eyes. but she laughed and worked and prayed alongside the very villagers who had once called for her exile. The fear had faded, replaced by a kind of familiar wonder. Anselm grew old. His hair turned to silver, and his back stooped, but his eyes remained clear. One sunny afternoon, he stood by his study window, watching Agnes haggle with a merchant in the market, a smile touching his lips. He turned back to his desk and pulled a heavy, leather-bound volume from a shelf. It was his Chronicle of the village, his life's work. He opened it to the pages concerning the year of the Green Children. There they were, the two accounts, filed together, one after the other, the neat scientific report and the raw, unbelievable testimony. He had never found an answer that could reconcile the two. He no longer looked for one. He had learned that the duty of a wise man was not to have all the answers, but to live in humble, faithful reverence of the questions. And in that, he had finally found a different kind of peace. What is so fascinating about the story of the Green Children is that, on one level, the mystery is easily solved. Modern historians suggest the children were likely Flemish orphans, malnourished and suffering from a type of anemia that can, in fact, tinge the skin green. It's a neat, logical explanation that closes the case. But does it really? Because the scientific fact of their condition doesn't explain away the power of their story. The priest, Anselm, could explain the how of their green skin, but he couldn't explain away the girl's memory of St. Martinus Land, a world of perpetual twilight, a place that felt more true to her than any medical diagnosis. This is where the story becomes so compelling. We have the truth of science, which is measurable and objective, and the truth of experience, which is personal and powerful. The villagers chose fear. They saw a demon, a changeling, because that story gave them a villain to blame for their misfortunes. But Anselm, in the end, chooses a different path. He doesn't pick a side. By writing down both his scientific observations and the girl's impossible testimony, he honors both truths. He accepts that the full story of a human life isn't just about the facts of the body, but also about the story of the soul. And that leaves us with a difficult question. If you were Anselm, tasked with creating the official record, which truth would you have chosen to preserve for history?